the machine will take every obstacle we throw in its way and find it as a challenge to add more to the budget.
Hi, I'm Dr. Amy Cerato, and we're sitting here in Edmond outside the Frenzy Brewing Company waiting for Dr. Chuck Marohn, the founder of Strong Towns Movement. And we're going to take him on a trip around town to see what he thinks about all the turnpikes in Oklahoma and what the real reason is that we can't seem to get away from building more roads and destroying more land. He also has a lot to say about how transportation industry should be transparent with its citizens, and we know that the Oklahoma Turnpike Authority is anything but transparent with its decisions on how it builds roadways throughout the state of Oklahoma. So we're pretty interested to hear what he has to say about our state. Cohen Associates is also an important name to remember. Now, February 22nd of this year, they announce the 3 turnpikes through Norman again after sitting on them for 25 years.
Wow.
They don't put them in exactly the same place, but they move them out a little bit. And they're going to take out 600 homes, 2,400 people directly, and then of course affect all of the wildlife. It's through a watershed that's a 303D watershed, which is an impaired watershed. Yeah. It's through Bureau of Reclamation, Land Management, Wildlife Management. It's through miles and miles of wetlands. They're going to have elevated bridge decks, 4,100 feet long, just crazy stuff. And as a civil engineer, I went to them and I said, this doesn't make any civil engineering sense. You're going through wetlands. You're going through 600 homes. You're going through wildlife corridors. You're going through the only known vein of rose rocks, barite rose rocks in the entire world. You're going to destroy everything. What are you doing? And they said, well, we're trying to relieve the congestion off I-35.
Right. Sounds like a good engineering challenge.
Right. And I said, well, you're actually not going to do that. I'm not a traffic engineer, but I used all your data and I did all your models, and we're not going to hit complete congestion if we keep driving the same exact way. We won't hit complete congestion until 2080.
Right.
And they said, then they started backing up. Well, it's all about safety. And I said, well, that's interesting because only one person has died in this stretch of I-35 in the last year, and it was alcohol induced.
Right.
So what are we talking about? Well, it come to find out that it's all about the money.
Yeah, there's a machine of highway building.
Yeah, and they need it's a Ponzi scheme. In other words, they have all these bonds to pay off, and they can't get new bonds until they put new alignments in.
Right.
And so they worked with the Chamber of Commerce and the developers who were buying out all these lands out in East Norman, with the hope that their 2025 Norman plan was coming up and they were redoing. And they wanted to keep with fidelity the high density inside of 48th and outside of 48th. They wanted 1 to 10 acres. But all of a sudden, now the city engineer and the city manager want to change that. And they say, well, now since the turnpikes are coming through, we're going to allow high density building out into the turnpike.
Right.
And so now it's not only the heavy contractors are making money, because they, unlike ODOT, the Department of Transportation, who bills on hours and material and time, these guys are allowed to build based on construction costs, so percentage of construction costs. And my students call me and say, Dr. Cerato, I'm so sorry, I know it's going to take at your home, but I've never been offered this much money before. A $500,000 geotech project is now $5 million.
Yeah.
And I said, I don't care how much money you're being offered. This is completely unethical.
Right.
And so it's that's where we're at. And as a civil engineer, I'm sure you've gone through this before. I was just flabbergasted because I honestly thought that people built things with integrity and ethics. And this time, they are building things for 2 reasons. 1, because they're running out of money and they need to re-up their bonds.
Right.
And 2, because they want to make their contractors, developers, real estate buddies a ton of money.
Yeah.
For no traffic. There's no traffic reasoning. And another thing I'd love to talk to you more about is induced demand, because I read a lot of that stuff on your site. The Katy Turnpike in Houston, Well, we brought up induced demand to the OTA and the ODOT engineers. First of all, the director of OTA said, I've never heard of induced demand.
Oh, seriously?
And I said, well, you obviously haven't graduated from the University of Oklahoma.
Yeah, or any
civil engineering.
Right.
Right. It's been around since the 1960s.
It's not a difficult concept.
Right, right. And then, you know, the second thing, well, it just...
Let's talk about the Ponzi scheme part.
Yeah, sure, let's do that.
Because I think a lot of people don't understand how that works or why that drives development that way or investments that way. So when the interstates were built and when really state highways, regional highways are built, they're built with federal matching dollars. There's all this money that comes in from the federal government. But when they're maintained, that money largely comes from the state. It comes from other channels, other sources that are more localized.
Right.
So the federal government essentially has said, if you're going to build a new lane mile, we're going to give you a lot of money to do that. If you're going to maintain an existing lane mile, we're going to give you a lot less money to do that. That's kind of your burden. And what that does is it creates this huge inducement for states, state departments of transportation, in your case, a state turnpike authority, to constantly be looking for the new project to do. And if you can add that additional lane, if you can do a little bit of realignment, if you can put in a new interchange, all of a sudden that project for you that was a maintenance project can now be slid under a different heading, be called an expansion project, and qualify for lots and lots of federal money.
Yeah.
And so what we see is that the federal dollars, even though a lot of politicians, the transportation secretary of the U.S., who, you know, is a decent guy, you know, even the president will say, you know, we want stuff maintained. This is about maintaining things. That's not the formulas. It's not the way it works out, and it's not the way the money allocates down. Over half of the, you know, the new transportation dollars we're spending on the new transportation bill are going to go for system expansion. And I actually think that's a low amount. I think it will end up being way more than that. And so, in a sense, the DOT, in your case, a turnpike, runs around looking for ways to do new projects.
Yeah.
So, you know, we look at these zombie projects that, like, you know, this one was dead 2.5 decades ago. All of a sudden rises from the dead and is given new life, even though no one's really worked on it, no one's pushing for it. The bureaucracy internal comes up with it. And the reason they come up with it is because they're looking for ways to tap into that money. The money is driving it. Now we can say they want to make their contractor friends money, and I think that is all like a secondary effect. It makes it easier. What it does is it creates a chorus of people that support the project, right? Because, you know, if you are an asphalt contractor or you're a paving company or you do concrete work, you've got all kinds of employees, they've got friends, you know, their job in theory depends on this money coming through. So you get this kind of groundswell of support for this stuff because it creates jobs, and you can go through this whole litany of things. But no one ever asks, you know, what would we do with that money if we weren't spending it on expansion? Could we maintain the stuff we have and employ these same exact people doing that kind of work? And the answer, of course, is yes. We actually have more stuff to maintain than we have money to maintain it.
Yeah.
And so we can keep those people very busy, but it's never presented in that way, right?
Yeah.
It's presented like we can do this, and this will create jobs, and it will be good, and you get this whole coalition of people together. Or we won't, and then you'll all suffer.
Yeah.
And, you know, to me, it's that argument is a bit of a distraction because it's never contrasted with the opposite. What would we do otherwise?
Yeah.
Right?
So Oklahoma has a pretty unique issue with the transportation conglomerate, I think, in that we have the same Secretary of Transportation, who's the same director of the Oklahoma Department of Transportation, who's the same director of the Oklahoma Turnpike Authority. And as the director of ODOT, Secretary Gatz, or Director Gatz, is in charge of all what you're talking about, all those federal dollars.
Right.
But as the director of the Oklahoma Turnpike Authority, by legislation, they are not allowed to use federal dollars. They can only use bond money. But what's happening is, with the same director, they're sharing pots of money.
Right.
And so the OTA is not self-sustainable because only 3 of their 11 turnpikes that they built in 70 years actually make money. But they legislated themselves a small prize. They can cross-pledge. So the Turner Turnpike can pay for the Chickasaw Turnpike. It can pay for the Indian Nation Turnpike. And
oh no, you're joking me.
No, I'm not joking. This is the problem. So every turnpike was supposed to be free after 30 years, but then they got smart and realized what a money train it was.
Right.
So they allowed.
So you just keep building turnpikes.
Exactly.
You can bump up your cash flow short term.
Yes.
Spread out those bond payments.
Right.
And make everybody happy.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And so then
that's a really bad set of incentives.
That's a very bad incentive. And then the other thing is, OTA doesn't have any on-staff engineering. So as the director of the OTA,
they can hire the DOT.
They hire the DOT to do their work.
Mm-hmm.
What they don't have to actually hire, there's no money that's being transferred. It's just do the work because you can do it.
Yeah.
And so now the Oklahoma Department of Transportation has been known to do things like, oh, okay, I'm going to buy that right of way with federal dollars. Oh, there's a turnpike coming through. Hey, OTA, here's that land. And so because with federal money, there are certain rules, right? You have to do the NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act rules. You have to do environmental studies. You have to do historical studies, archaeological studies. But you know what you have to do with bond money? Nothing. Mm-hmm. They could wipe out your house in 90 days without telling you why they're doing it. And so in Oklahoma, we have given this instrumentality of the state the sovereign powers of eminent domain, and yet they have to show no proof of viability, of revenue generation, of traffic usage. They can just build wherever they want, and that is so... Talking about strong towns, that is not a transparent way to build roads.
Yeah.
And it's even worse than probably using federal dollars.
I've seen this kind of thing before, because what happens is that, as you say, certain streams of money has certain things, strings attached to it, right? And local bonding money is the freest, right? It's the freest of encumbrance. And so, in a sense, you can outsource the nasty part of the project to the part that doesn't have the encumbrance, and then make the nice, easy, happy part of the project the part that has to go through NEPA, or the part that has to undergo public scrutiny, or what have you.
Yeah.
That's a very common tactic. Even when you don't have a consolidated decision-making process, bureaucracies tend to scratch each other's back and make things work in that way.
Yeah.
And transportation dollars are kind of the largest just fund of money sloshing through from the federal, state to the local governments for projects like this. They induce residential subdivisions, commercial developments. We're sitting here and there's a Little Caesars and a Subway. These are all, in every city around the country, because they're all grafted on to this same flow of federal funds to the state government, matched with state gas tax dollars that the federal government helped them set up and induce. And then the project cudgel comes with, as you say, in this case, the ability to bond and the ability to, in a sense, Ponzi scheme cash flow the next project, the last project with the next project. That's it. I realize it can feel very personal here. It's actually a story we see repeated over and over again around the country. Yeah. It's crazy how often this happens. Yeah. And it really, there is a very conservative argument against government that a lot of progressive-minded people push back on. The idea that, once you start a program, it never ends. Once you give a program money, it will build up constituents around it, and it will keep searching for reasons to exist. We funded the interstate system in the 1950s, and we finished building the original interstate system by the end of the 1960s. The very last segments were built in really slow fashion over that following decade. We've literally been done with it for 30 years. In most cases, 40 or 50 years. Yet the program lives on. Yeah. And it still finds reasons to exist. And it still looks out and projects doom if we don't get more money. It still, looks to the next big development that we can do with this money. And it has created a massive bureaucracy around itself to self-perpetuate.
Yeah.
We have to actually reach the point where we recognize that we built out the transportation system as it was originally envisioned. Like we're done. We did it. It's great. Yeah. Now let's make good use of it.
Right.
And I'm sure you can see this as a civil engineer. We don't make very good use of our infrastructure at all.
No.
We're driving along a Stroad here.
Yes.
It's midday on a Tuesday. Traffic is rather light because, of course, it's always light. If you look out, you see a development pattern that is very similar to the rest of North America. And the buildings are all spread out from each other. Mm-hmm. There's huge amounts of green space and distance between them. There's very large parking lots, and this all seems very normal to us. But if you look at the amount of public investment in the ground, the linear feet of pipe, the linear feet of drainage systems, of water systems, you look at the amount of sidewalk, the square foot of asphalt we have here, and you realize that all of that is a public liability. This tax base is a pittance. It's a tiny trickle of what is needed to maintain that much public responsibility.
Right.
Yet our response is to build the next one and the next one and the next one. And there is an end to it, right? It's not a happy end, but there is an end to it. And I think I get your frustration is that we don't want to be, the next project in this Ponzi scheme. I am sympathetic to that, but it's a big machine and it's really hard to stop it.
Yeah.
I think it will continue to run until it collapses. And when it collapses, that will not be good for any of us.
Yeah. And speaking of how we pay for it, you had mentioned the gas tax. So interestingly enough, I looked all over the internet and found other states that were looking into trying to replace their gas tax shortage with the fuel efficiency and the move to electric vehicles. Well, Oklahoma just passed the House Bill 1712, which establishes the road user charge program.
Okay.
And they're trying to, in most states, are trying to add a user fee to every road, every free road. So not only do you pay for the roads with your taxes, but now you're going to be taxed to drive on the roads and the user fee.
Okay. Will this be like a mileage charge?
Some states have put through a mileage charge.
Yeah, I've seen those.
Yeah, and so every road would be a turnpike. So you'd drive to the store, you drive your kid to an activity, and you'd have to pay a certain amount of money. And
let me say this: I don't necessarily, in theory, think that's a bad concept. I actually wrote in my book about that being kind of the framework of a good way of approaching things. The challenge is going to be, of course, tying that into traffic volumes. Most of the roads that we have, if you were actually going to charge, we can sit and look at this Stroad right here, and we can calculate how much is this going to cost to repair over the next generation. We could sit down and do that. We could come up with a number, and then we say, here's how many vehicles a day, and here's therefore what you would need to pay every time you go down here to actually take care of this road. If we charge that amount, nobody would drive.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Like very few people would drive anywhere.
Right.
And so then you say, well, okay, we need then like federal money to help us. Okay, why? Who's paying the federal money? It's not like that just...
It's not that's
right.
not free.
Like, isn't that us? Like, don't we pay?
Right.
Like if it doesn't justify itself. So what I see with the user fees is that it becomes yet another supplement of bad development patterns.
Right.
as opposed to an actual thoughtful, methodical system of trying to pay for the infrastructure you have.
Yeah.
Because there should be a feedback loop, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you run a business and you can't charge enough to sell a certain product or provide a certain service, if the market won't pay what it costs you, you discontinue that service.
Yeah.
You discontinue selling the product. We can't make a profit doing that. We can't make it cash flow. For government, the feedback that we tend to get is we can't make this one cash flow, ergo we need to go do 10 more.
Yeah.
Right? It's like we lose money on every job and then we make it up in volume. That is a system that the free market punishes mercilessly, that governments get away with, particularly in transportation, for a long, long time.
Yeah, and there's been people that have been pushing for years through the NAFTA corridors to make trucks pay their fair share because the trucks tear up the roads.
The trucks do 100 times damage of an automobile, right?
Yeah, and so that would be one way. But I guess going back to one of your points is, how do you even stop the machine? How do you stop it?
Well,
we teach in civil engineering, they teach a specific transportation course, and they don't ever talk to you about what your Strong Towns website is about, and so they get out and they work for the DOTs, and then we keep perpetuating this big snowball of infrastructure.
We look at transportation as a good unto itself.
Yeah.
The more transportation we build, the better off we are. And that theory, if we went back to 1950 and we looked at a continent, North America, that was connected by trains, had limited automobile access around the country, you could drive across the country in a month. Yes, absolutely. Changing that so you could get across the country in 2 days was utterly transformative. But the idea that we can get from Edmond to downtown Oklahoma City in 14 minutes instead of 14 minutes and 32 seconds, that changes nothing, but it costs billions and billions of dollars.
Right.
We're far past the point of diminishing returns. And I feel like the engineering profession mindset is still trapped in the engineering economics of the 1950s and 1960s. And I took engineering economics. I'm sure you did.
Yeah.
This is part of the program of teaching young people how to do engineering. You have a project. It has an annual cost. You've got a salvage value. You can calculate all this. That's economics really from the 1950s and 1960s, where it was all new stuff. Today, we're talking about a system that has been built out. It's done.
Yeah.
And how do we squeeze more value out of it? How do we maintain it? And it's a different set of economics.
Yeah.
So the question you had was, how do you stop the machine? And I feel like the obvious insight is not the way we've been doing it.
Yeah.
Right? I think largely the people who have opposed the machine of highway building have come at it from an environmental standpoint or a social justice standpoint. And I get that. I'm sympathetic to those arguments. I understand that. But you were describing the project here as going through wetlands and sensitive areas. And for someone who's environmentally minded, that's important. For an engineer, it's like, wow, that's a great design challenge.
Yeah, yeah.
How do we build through the middle of this wetland and have the minimum amount of impact? And sure, it might add an extra $1 billion to the project, but wow, that makes the project probably award-winning. I mean, that's really fascinating. Mm-hmm. So when the default setting is we're always going to build more, the machine will take every obstacle we throw in its way and find it as a challenge to add more to the budget, add more to the project, do more.
Right.
It's not something that will actually stop it. Yeah. To stop these projects, we need culturally a different vision for how we're going to experience prosperity. And right now, the vision is we build the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and it's that repetitive growth that is going to drive our economy, make us more successful, make us more prosperous. And what we can clearly see is that it leaves behind it this wake of decline. this wake of stagnation, and more people are getting caught in that, and fewer people ultimately wind up benefiting from that next iteration of growth. We need a development pattern, we need an investment cycle that actually invests in existing places, making them better places to live, getting more value out of them, and then we can actually invest less and get a lot greater return.
Yeah, and what we see a lot in Oklahoma City is such a big sprawling city, and I don't know if you've ever driven through it. Well, we have a lot of empty things. So that was the old thing. We have a lot of empty malls and empty strip malls and empty inner city buildings. And like
we're
what
sitting
you're
across from one right now.
We sprawl out these cities, put up all these strip malls and places with huge parking lots that you need a car to get to. You can't get to without a car. You can't, there's no sidewalks, there's no rail, there's no alternative transportation. And then in a couple years they end up empty, and then we go and sprawl some more.
This is a development equivalent of slash and burn agriculture. You come in, you cut down the trees, you plant something, you burn up the soil. When the soil's not producing anymore, you move on to the next one.
Right.
And you leave in your wake something that is kind of stripped of resource and incapable of being fertile, incapable of being productive. I don't even know what this business used to be, but I know what it can't be. It can't be anything else than what it originally was designed to be.
Right.
So you've got a fast food drive-through restaurant. It's never going to be a shoe store. It failed as what it is, and now you're stuck with a failure. They're actually really cheap buildings. We think of these as large investments because they tend to pay a lot of money because of the way that they cash flow themselves.
Right.
But the reality is even the big box store over there, you're talking about a building that is being built at $25, $30 a square foot.
Right.
These are super cheap buildings. So your question was, what do we do with this? And I think, to me, I struggle because part of this, to me, looks just like it's ready to be abandoned. But I can tell you what a successful place doesn't do. A successful place doesn't go build another version of this when they have one that's already failing.
Right. I feel like a lot of developers that I'm aware of are in it for the quick cash, the quick money, make their money, and then go on and do the same thing, slash and burn someplace else, quick money, get out. And they do build cheap buildings that don't last very long and that have lots of repair. And of course the sprawl, like you said, all the pipes and the sewers that you need for all this infrastructure that we keep.
The developer needs to be able to cash flow the building they're building.
You're right.
They need to be able to get out of that building in 3, 5, 7 years. They can't make long-term commitments. They are, in a sense, short-term players. Who's not the short-term player? The government is supposed to be not the short-term player.
Right.
The government's supposed to be one that is looking out and saying, all right,
the long term.
We're making a 50-year commitment on this Stroad here. We, on behalf of all the taxpayers, all the property owners in the city, are making multi-million-dollar investments in infrastructure. What is our return on that investment?
Right.
On behalf of the community we serve, what are we getting out of that money that we're spending?
Yeah.
And that's where we're breaking down.
Yeah.
The state, the region, the cities, they're not doing that basic math.
Right.
And because of that, they're, in a sense, tools of the development machine at the expense of the taxpayers, the general public, and the reality is the property owners of the city.
Right. But this is the Kilpatrick Turnpike. It's one of the turnpikes that was built in the early 90s. It's one of the 11 turnpikes that actually makes money for the Turnpike Authority, but that's because they give their people no other option than to get on it. Not only that, but they're going to add 2 more lanes, one on the south side, one on the north side, to make it a 3-lane, both-way turnpike, and then triple the tolls, so all the local residents will be forced to pay to travel to work. All right.
Let's go look at it.
All right.
This is where I feel like we're in this like pseudo-scientific world, and depending on what your worldview is, you are completely skeptical of subset of models A, B, and C, but completely embrace subset of models D, E, and F. And they're essentially the same thing. You're modeling massively complex systems with adaptive feedback loops. So let's just look at traffic modeling for a second, which tends to be embraced by a certain group of people and rejected by others. I think it should be rejected by everybody, because when we make it easier for people to drive, what do people do? They will opt for trips that they otherwise wouldn't take.
Right.
If it takes 20 minutes to get to the store, but now all of a sudden I change it and make it 15, more people will decide to go to the store because it's less of a burden. And if it takes 30 minutes for my commute and you make it 20, some people will enjoy that 20-minute commute and sleep in an extra 10 minutes, but a lot of people will adapt to that by driving 10 minutes more to find a house.
Right.
And so you get this feedback loop where congestion returns to the same over time. The conclusion then, if you're thoughtful, that you have to get to, is that congestion is in a sense an adaptable response, one that we can't get away from, one that is in a sense inevitable in the system that we built, but one that humans have many different options to respond to. And let's just look at the go into the store to get milk one. If it's 10 minutes to go to the store and get milk, and then congestion rears its ugly head and all of a sudden it's 20 minutes, well, as a person, I have a number of responses. I can go at a different time. I can pair that trip with a different trip. I can buy extra milk when I'm there, so I have to make fewer trips. I can have my milk delivered so that I don't have to experience that congestion. I can pay someone else to do it. Or, and here's the novel one, I can have someone start a store closer to me that sells milk that I could get to. And that's the option that local governments tend to take off the table through zoning, through land use regulation. Nope, we're not going to allow you to have a corner store that sells milk. No, we're not going to allow you to have a coffee shop in your neighborhood. No, we're not going to allow you to do normal things that humans have done throughout all of human history in their neighborhoods. We are at the limit. We are beyond the limit of being able to solve congestion by building more stuff, more transportation.
Yes.
The only way we will deal with congestion today is to make our neighborhoods more responsive to the day-to-day needs of the humans that live there. I know of one city that solved their congestion problem by building more stuff, and that city is Detroit. Detroit built more and more and more lanes, tore down more and more and more neighborhoods, expanded their transportation system more and more and more, until they had a place that they literally not only could not afford, but that nobody wanted to live in. And now if you go to Detroit, you will drive through neighborhoods that have abandoned homes, beautiful mansions with trees growing up in the middle of them that have been completely abandoned, that are next to 8-lane roads through the middle of the neighborhood. And there's no congestion at all. Congestion is it's one of those Yogi Berra-isms, right? Nobody goes there anymore because it's too busy. The only thing worse than having a congested roadway is having no congestion.
Yeah, and having destroyed all the land, which I hope one day you get to drive on the Kilpatrick Turnpike, which was an unauthorized road that the Turnpike put in 2016, which is the starting point for how they think they can get more roads through Norman. It connects I-44 to I-40, and they, like I said, they took down 104 homes and built this sweeping 18-mile 4-lane road through farmland and people's homes and ranches, and literally less than 2,000 cars drive on this per day. But it's...
So the question that I have for the Turnpike Authority, and the question that I would have for the DOT is, at what point do you reach the end? Like, what does the system as it's completed look like?
Yeah.
And I think their response would be, well, if the community keeps growing, there's going to be additional demand, and we're going to keep adding and keep adding and keep adding in response to that growth and that demand.
Yeah.
And that argument would have a tiny bit of credibility, except for the fact that the number of lane miles, the amount of money spent, the budgets for transportation have all increased vastly more than the actual population. You have cities like mine where we haven't had any population increase since the end of World War II, but we have 10 times the amount of lane miles we now maintain. What is that? Well, that's just us driving around more. Is that really a productive thing?
Yeah.
That we can all now have more miles every year? It's not like my ancestors didn't have milk and didn't use toilet paper and didn't go buy toothpaste at the store. They did all those things. We just do it with 10 times the amount of traffic. So the question becomes, if it's growth and demand and growth that is driving this, then why is your spending going up at vastly greater rates than actual growth? What growth are you looking at? If we're saying growth in population is going to be 2%, 3%, 5%, I don't know what it is here in the Oklahoma City region, but if we're going to say that, then okay, fine. Let's limit our transportation lane mile growth to 2% a year or 3% a year, whatever that is. We can't do that because the Ponzi scheme nature of the finance of it would collapse.
Right.
And so we have to build exponentially more every year. And that's why you wind up with projects that are quite ludicrous. If we went back to the 1950s and the 1960s and someone came to Oklahoma City and said, look, we're going to build a highway to connect Oklahoma City and Tulsa, we would look at that and we would say, yeah, like that is really going to benefit the state of Oklahoma. That's going to make a lot of sense. We're going to build a highway to connect Tulsa and Little Rock. You'd be like, okay, I can see where that would be transformative for our economy. But when you come and say, we're going to put a third loop around this with an additional 2 lanes, at the cost of billions of dollars, and by the way, we're going to finance that with a huge amount of public debt that is non-recourse, is like not retirable by the project that we're doing. I think we have to step back and ask ourselves financially, we're just lying to ourselves. Like, what do we think we're accomplishing with that? And this is, I think, the trap that you have gotten yourself in here, is that the questions that you're asking are the wrong ones. How do we build more? How do we get the next thing? And you've lost all grounding with what you actually need and can put to productive use.
There's a new push by the federal government to put billions of dollars back into states to dismantle bad infrastructure, and it's I forget what it's exactly called, but it's something like reconnecting communities, and they're giving state DOTs $50 million, $150 million to take down roadways. And so Albany took them up on it, the city of Albany. They wiped out something like 9,000 people back in the 60s or 70s and put an 8-lane road right through the center. And then all of a sudden 25% of their city left. And they've been a depressed city since then. And now they're going to wipe out that turnpike or the highway and put it back. And I feel like the state of Oklahoma is headed in that direction in terms of they're going to need to dismantle a lot of the things that they've built over the years, and we just don't know how to get the state DOTs to pay attention to the bigger picture, to the more federal picture now of they realize they made a mistake with transportation. They're coming in to try to fix it. But Oklahoma's going the other way. They're building more alignments, you know? It's kind of opposite.
You have you put yourself on a path to bankrupt the state.
Yeah.
And yes, my frustration with the federal government is that a lot of that money to reconnect communities is what the program's called. Of the $800 billion in transportation money in the bill, it's something like $8 billion or 12. I mean, I don't know the exact number. It's a pittance. It's a token amount.
Right.
And I think the people who are proponents of it would say, well, it might be a token amount, but it's an important token, and it's going to get the conversation moving and things rolling. I feel like I don't want to get too moral and righteous sounding, but I look at the immense amount of destruction that federal transportation policy has done to cities and to places where people live and to neighborhoods. And if I were to prioritize the massive infrastructure bill, I would have two priorities. Number one, maintaining the systems we have. And number two, going back and fixing the horrible damage that we've done. And if the federal government can come in and help states, help cities actually become viable, the old adage, catch a fish for someone versus teach them to fish, is really not an adage of know-how as much as it is an adage about self-resiliency, right? We want to, when we come in with a federal intervention, we don't want to create cities and states that are dependents. We want to actually help them become stronger and help them become more resilient and help them stand on their own 2 feet. And the reality is our federal transportation spending has weakened states, made them wards, and essentially, of the federal government. And the spending programs we do now are just driving states like Oklahoma further into insolvency. The exact opposite of what we should be looking to do.
So what's your advice for PikeOffOTA and the freeway fighters that were trying to stop all these new alignments, and they've been working on them for decades and doing everything under the table and trying to push this through before we can legally stop them? What would be advice from someone that's seen this all over the country?
It's a really good question, and it's a really hard question, because it would be really nice if I could tell you, here's the 3 things to do to stop this project. There really isn't. We've created this system, and I think we should step back and point out that in one of the most polarized Congresses that there has ever been, the only thing we can agree on is to spend a ton of money building highways. I mean, literally, that is the bipartisan consensus right now. So I will tell you what I have seen work. The places that I have seen resist this have great local leadership that are able to speak a broad and inclusive vision, one that sees a role for people living in neighborhoods and also sees a role for development in the private sector to prosper in a place that grows stronger and more viable over time. Without that local capacity, what I see is that places just get run over. And you might have local heroes who can stand up and push back. You might have individuals and groups that can forestall things, in a sense, do heroic work, buying time. But without that kind of broad community consensus that this is destroying our future, this is actually wrecking our prosperity, this is ruining our opportunities, this is robbing from us capacity to do good things here. Without that consensus in the community, it's going to be really hard to resist it.
We want to thank you so much for coming and talking with us. It's been a pleasure. I told my students this morning about strongtowns.org, so hopefully they know what Stroads means now. And hopefully you've enjoyed your time around Edmond, and we'd love to welcome you to come check out Norman, and hopefully by the time you come, we've stopped the Turnpike Authority from building in our city.
I hope that it works out for you.
Yes, thank you.
I do wish you luck. It is a huge challenge, but I love your enthusiasm, and I love the attitude and the analysis. It's a beautiful place. It deserves saving. It deserves people who love it and care for it. So I'm glad you're here doing this.
Thank you. That was our drive with Mr. Chuck Marohn from strongtowns.org. Please do go check out that website and learn all about fancy terminology like Stroads and Induced Demand and all the things we should be doing with our streets and roadways. And if you like this video, please give us a thumbs up and go to www.PikeOffOTA.com and click on our newsletter. Give us your email and we'll send you a newsletter every week. Stay tuned because we have lots of content to come in the coming weeks. And hit that subscribe button right here on YouTube.
sticking around this long, and we just dropped Chuck off for him to give a speech in Edmond about his Strongtown movement. If you'd like to watch that video, you can click right here.